Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome back. We took a little bit of a break last week. I'll talk about it. I'm glad to see so many people here, fewer than usual. I asked my parents to come because I was afraid that nobody would show up. They're canceling events left, right, and center. So on the program, we were supposed to speak about the AIPAC policy conference, and then an update on the Israeli and the U.S. elections, and we will. But we'll start with the coronavirus because I think it impacts everyone and everything, and events are getting canceled left, right, and center. The AIPAC conference took place this year at the beginning of March. I think that if they would have had it like they did last year and the year before at the end of March, it might have been canceled. Federation has canceled 2 trips, and they're likely to cancel a 3rd. The Israeli government, the health ministry, has not prohibited, but it has strongly advised its citizens from visiting how many countries around the world? Take a guess.
7.
All of them. All of them. There's a blanket advisory. I went to a dinner the other evening here in Miami Beach. The head of a major hospital, Rambam Hospital in Haifa, was supposed to address us, but he wasn't allowed to leave the country for fear that if he came to the United States, he might be quarantined on his way back and wouldn't be able to perform. So his deputy showed up, and I asked her, "You must be pretty expendable. Why'd they send you?" And she said, I was already in Boston. But that's what it's come to. Israel has 19 reported cases of corona, and has self-quarantined close to 100,000 people. New York City, with twice the population, has 22 reported cases, twice as many, and has quarantined so far fewer than 3,000. But those have been disproportionately within the Jewish community and the modern Orthodox community. There's a school in the Bronx, SAR, shut down. Yeshiva University, shut down. Yeshiva University finally has a pretty good basketball team. They made it to the tournament for potentially the Division III championship in Baltimore. They're playing to an empty audience. No people in the stands. The teams are going to be allowed to play on the field, but fans are not coming to the arena. It's not going to be half empty, it's going to be completely empty. The Nefesh B'Nefesh Aliyah, big main event, canceled. There have been so many disruptions already in an environment that, I don't mean to belittle it, but statistically speaking, it's not extraordinarily relevant. Let's do the math. So if you look at China, where all this started, in one province in Hubei, main city Wuhan, so they had 70,000 of the 84,000 cases reported in China. So that means if you take the rest of China, you have a little over 13,000 cases out of a population of 1.3 billion people. That's 0.001%. That means that 1 in 100,000 people will get coronavirus. You don't want to be that one person, but statistically speaking, that is very, very small. And not everybody dies. In fact, the mortality rate outside Hubei, outside that province, is about 0.7. That means 1 out of 140, 150 people who get the virus will die. And those are disproportionately elderly people with pre-existing conditions, particularly respiratory conditions, where the mortality rates are going to be higher. So now there was a reported increase of cases, and people are now really worried that now you have a lot of what they call asymptomatic cases, where people are actually sick, but they don't have any of the symptoms of the sickness. And that's a bad thing, because people can be sick and right next to you and you don't know it. But that also means that if the number of cases are higher and the number of deaths, those are harder to hide, is the same, then the mortality rates go down further still. Another interesting statistic in China, maybe to give you a little bit of comfort, is that the rate of recovery is 10,000 a month. So there are many more people in China now who have already recovered from the coronavirus than those who still have it. So if you look at the numbers, it's about 84,000 people who contracted it, about 45,000 people who recovered, 3,000 people who unfortunately died, and the balance are people who hopefully are on their way to a complete recovery. But that doesn't stop people from getting scared. At AIPAC we'll talk about the AIPAC conference in a second, We had one person who went to school with somebody whose father, I actually know the man, is a fellow named Lawrence Garbus. He's a lawyer in New York City, 51 years old, he lives in New Rochelle. And he's in home quarantine. Both of his kids have it. One goes to SAR High School in the Bronx, the other goes to Yeshiva University, and therefore anybody in contact with that family is being quarantined. So we were now given an advisory. Everybody who attended the AIPAC policy conference, if you want to give AIPAC credit for anything, you certainly have to give them credit for communication, production value. Gary was there. I don't know, was anybody else here in the room at the AIPAC policy conference? All right, hopefully we'll get better participation next year. But especially among Canadians, I'll talk a lot about the Canadian contingent that attended. My experience this year started 4 days earlier here at Moe's Delicatessen over across the mall in Aventura. We had an event. I co-chair a bipartisan pro-Israel PAC, and we had an event with 3 Democrats who were here trying to raise money. Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, Elaine Luria from Virginia, and Max Rose from New York. They're all Jewish. Josh did his national service at Harvard Law School, but he's been a public servant since graduating. Tremendously energetic, telegenic politician, very smart, very fair, very driven, and very, very strong on our issues. Elaine Luria was a naval intelligence officer and a captain of a submarine. So her national security credentials are unimpeachable. Max Rose, similarly, an infantry commander in Afghanistan and Iraq. And these guys were screaming, "Don't forget us. We are the core of a part of the Democratic Party that's extremely important, because if we lose, we'll likely lose in primaries." They actually, all 3 of them are in swing districts. Elaine Luria represents the area of Newport News, where there's a large naval base that the military tends to swing a little bit more to the right. Max Rose is in Staten Island, which also has been a little bit to the right of center, especially when you consider that it's in New York City. And Josh Gottheimer is in Bergen County, New Jersey, that has a large Jewish population, but is upwardly wealthy. All 3 of them would have acknowledged that if Sanders will win the nomination, they don't have a chance. And Senator Sanders did more than anybody else to make this AIPAC conference probably the most cohesive collegial conference I can remember, and I've been going since 1989. So even though we're in an election year, and I was there in 2016, and it was extremely divisive. If you were pro-Trump, or even pro-Cruz, Trump didn't have the nomination yet, you would be considered a Neanderthal by people who were supportive of Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders did not show up to that conference. Bernie Sanders has been in Congress for 30 years. We'll talk about him when we discuss the American election at the end. And he's never shown up to any AIPAC policy conference. Not only not as a speaker, but also not sort of in the corridors, the schmoozing, I assume he would let his constituents from Vermont lobby him on the lobbying day. Everybody does. But he didn't proactively attend any of the policy conferences since he was elected to the conference. To the Congress, ironically also 1989 as a congressman, and then 2007 in the Senate. What did you have? You had 18,000 people. 18,000 people, that's an enormous number of people in Washington, 275 synagogue delegations, 5,000 college students from 600 different campuses. You had Republicans, you had Democrats, you had Jews, you had Gentiles, you had Christians, you had Muslims. You had, across the spectrum, black, white, Latino, evangelicals. It was an amazing demonstration of solidarity around a core issue, and that is the bipartisan support of Israel. And there was an instance when then candidate Trump spoke at policy conference in 2016, and he said that then President Obama was the worst thing that ever happened to Israel. Some people cheered, and AIPAC had to issue a formal apology to the president, to the White House, a formal apology to the attendees, because they felt, and I personally tend to agree, that it was inappropriate to cheer a statement where the incumbent president of the United States is being disparaged by a candidate running for office. This year, Howard Kaur, the executive director of AIPAC, opened the conference by saying that if you are if you are disparaging towards, he didn't mention Senator Sanders by name, but he specifically said, and it was very clear to everybody in the audience who he was referring to, that if you're not a friend of Israel, you're not a friend of ours, and if you disparage he took it personally, obviously, because there was a specific disparagement of AIPAC, followed by calling the Prime Minister of Israel a radical racist. We'll talk about that when we discuss the Israeli election. And then Danny Danon, the Israel ambassador to the United Nations, didn't mince words. He didn't be cute or nuanced, referring to Senator Sanders by Sanders. You're not welcome here. You're not welcome in Israel. We don't like you. So that was pretty harsh, and I thought I was very curious after hearing that whether AIPAC would issue some sort of explanation. It did not, and the rest of the conference was kind of punctuated by that recognition that there is a groundswell of support. Remember when we started the AIPAC Policy Conference on Sunday? Joe Biden had just won a decisive victory in South Carolina. Tom Steyer had taken himself out of the race on Saturday night after that result, but not only was Biden in it, Buttigieg was in it, Klobuchar was in it, Mike Bloomberg was in it. Mike Bloomberg was the only person who actually addressed the policy conference from the podium, and he gave a very good speech. I wish he had said some of the things that he said in Washington at the debate in South Carolina when he had an opportunity to really rebut the comments made by Senator Sanders in response, in an opportunity to walk back some of the things he said about AIPAC. He chose not to walk back, but double down by calling Prime Minister Netanyahu a radical racist. And then when the question went to Mike Bloomberg, he bumbled and fumbled, and 3 days later, 4 days later, a week later, his speechwriters gave him a much better content, which he delivered flawlessly with a few unfortunate jokes in front of a very large audience in Washington, D.C. But you had what one would expect. You had leaders from the Democratic Party, like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Bob Menendez, who are strong on the Israel issue. Sometimes we hold them to a higher standard. You should have said this. You could have said that. You weren't objecting loudly enough when these other people made those comments, and maybe that's true, but it was critically important for those voices to be heard. AIPAC has a long-standing policy that it does not allow American politicians to do remote addresses, videos. Apparently, I don't know if this is true, but apparently Sanders, who was busy campaigning against Secretary Clinton in 2016, offered to do a video in 2016, and he was rebuffed. I don't know if that's true or not. This year, he obviously publicly boycotted, along with Senator Warren, the conference. But Senator Klobuchar and Vice President Biden did address the audience by video, as did Prime Minister Netanyahu and General Benny Gantz. Israelis have always been allowed to do that. I mean, you understand that it's 6,000 miles away, so you're going to cut the Israelis some slack if they want to do a video, but you want to get people to come to Washington, D.C., especially because they're normally just across the mall, and it shouldn't be that much trouble to get to the convention center for half an hour. In this case, I don't know why. They had no way of knowing that Israel would have a third election in 11 months, but they would have known 4 years ago when Super Tuesday would have fallen. So I was curious why. Maybe they didn't think that many senators would be running for office, but I think I still don't understand why that timing took place. But because of the Super Tuesday conflict, they amended their policy for this year and allowed Senator Klobuchar and Vice President Biden to speak. And they said what you'd expect them to say. You know, that our hearts are in it, we get it, we're very supportive of the relationship. It's extremely important to be bipartisan. And Cory Booker, Senator Booker from New Jersey, gave a Baptist oration. He brought himself to tears. I mean, I thought there was a little bit drama, hyperbole. If you want to look up something, he's probably on YouTube. I'm sure someone filmed it. He was the darling of the Jewish community. Shmuley Boteach, Rabbi Boteach, and was his rabbi when they were both at Oxford together. And you know, he just right out of central casting. He's an African American, went to Stanford, Rhodes Scholar, played tight end for the Cardinal, the Stanford football team, and he, you know, was the mayor of Newark, then ran for the Senate. He got enormous support within the Jewish community, but then when it seemed to be less expedient politically, given the tack that the party was taking, sorry to my left, you're right. He disappointed a lot of people, and he wasn't getting the kind of support he expected, and this was clearly an opportunity for him to be front and center. But the big difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is the Republicans were on offense. They showed up, whether it's House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Vice President Pence, the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. One by one, they got up on stage to David Friedman, who's an ambassador, so you don't expect him to be as much of a politician, more of a diplomat, but he was as political and as partisan as anybody, basically reminding the crowd, we got off to a good start in this administration when it comes to Israel 3 years ago, but we did things, we moved the embassy to Jerusalem, that's old news, right? Just applaud us on what happened since we were here less than a year ago at Policy Conference. We recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. We closed the Palestinian office in Washington, D.C. because they refused to stop this pay-for-slay policy of rewarding terrorists or family of terrorists for their lethal activities. And we acknowledge that under international law, the settlements are not illegal. They are not violations of international law. You can argue whether or not they're, politically appropriate, but they are certainly not a violation of international law the way this administration interprets that. And that's kind of cool. If I'm about to give a speech, I'd love to show up on stage to a friendly audience and say, look what I've done in less than 12 months. And no other president, no other administration did that. They all had an opportunity. Israel declared its sovereignty over the Golan Heights in 1968. That was, 52 years ago. And no administration came close to acknowledging Israeli sovereignty over that. And the whole issue of the settlements was ambiguous. There's an argument to be made that Eugene Rostow, who was then negotiating on behalf of the United States and formulated Article 242 that talks about territories and not the territories, felt that but that wasn't discussed. That wasn't as much of an issue back in the 60s and 70s. But in the past 20, 25 years, there's been this fetish around the settlements and their legality, and there seems to be an international consensus that they're illegal. And here's an administration that's coming and saying that it's not. So the speakers were very popular. The content, if you look at the booklet that you get, the content was extremely robust. I mean, there was something for everybody. If you're Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, interfaith relations, the peoplehood, Jewish people, Israel, and I was impressed to see that there was really a large Canadian contingent. John Baird has been coming since he's been the foreign ministry, so he's been coming to AIPAC for 5 or 6 years. The AJC, I remember we brought the AJC to our global forum, and he became the foreign minister in 2011, so he came in 2012. And Prime Minister Harper has been coming since 2017, and he always gives the keynote speech at the international. I think we spent some time there at the international reception. There were very few Canada-only, in terms of content, Canada-only gatherings, but there was one where Foreign Minister Baird appeared along with Anthony Householder. If you're from Montreal, he's the MP from the Liberal MP from Mount Royal. He took over Erwin Kotler's seat. Erwin was at the conference as well. And the moderator was Michel Marceau. If you're from Quebec, he had the Charlesbourg seat for the Bloc Québécois in Parliament for many years, but he then remarried to a Jewish partner, and he's got it in his kishkas, and that's how he would say it. But it was interesting to see Anthony, who's much younger than John Baird, but not that much. I mean, Anthony's probably 46, and Baird's probably 50. He's a young former. I mean, he did so much at a young age that it's hard to remind yourself that you literally probably just turned 50. And it sounded a lot like what a friendly centrist debate would be in the United States if you found a moderate Republican and a moderate Democrat. But the audience was very much attacking House Feather because the expectation was, why don't you stand up to the international community the way the Harper government did? The Trudeau government has not been as engaged, has not been as active, and House Feather said, whoa, wait a second. We have voted in favor of Israel and UN resolutions, 95% of the time. If there were 25 resolutions, we were there for 23 or 24 of them. And the Harper government had voted in favor of Israel resolutions for 62% of the time, whatever the number was. It was just under 2/3, I remember that. And then John Baird said something very interesting. The Harper government came into office in 2006, but he only became foreign minister in 2011. And he said, look, I acknowledge that the Harper government looked and felt much more similar to the Martin government in its first term in office. But once Stephen appointed me foreign minister, we've had a perfect record. And then House Feather acknowledged, yes, that's true. So it was, I sort of obviously have some affinity to Canada, but looking at it as a Canadian through an American prism, it was very interesting to see that in Canada they're going through a similar challenge within the Jewish community by what standards you're going to hold your politicians to. And if the Trudeau government is coming really close to the very, very, very best that the Harper government was able to achieve, which from a pro-Israel standpoint is the very, very best that not only any Canadian administration ever achieved, but any Western country ever achieved, there is an opportunity to acknowledge that as being a pretty good score. So I'm not here as an apologist for either party, neither in Canada nor in the United States, but I do think that the political advocacy in the United States and the Jewish community in the United States has had a longer run. There's a lot more money involved in the political process here. There's a lot more engagement that takes place on an intimate level with congressional representatives in the House and the Senate. AIPAC 30 years ago launched an initiative called NLN, New Leadership Network, where a donor adopts a congressman in Nebraska or Kansas. I mean, it could be here in South Florida, but it's much more interesting if you're in Nebraska or Kansas and you develop a relationship with somebody who has no Jewish constituents, doesn't know anything about what's going on in the Israel-Arab conflict. But suddenly you send them talking points and policy papers and you ask them whether or not they're going to sign on to a bill or co-sponsor a piece of legislation. And then you have a fundraiser for them. And Hebrew they say, what are you going to do? That makes the difference. People care. And if you give them a check for $15,000, that buys a little bit of ad time. Now that Bloomberg's out of the race, it buys a lot more ad time in some of these local markets. And then you develop a relationship with them. So AIPAC, of which John Baird is a board member, has now adopted something called Adopt an MP, which is similar. So you'll have usually, I would say, like-aged people, 40s, 50s, 60s, start talking to somebody in Saskatchewan, start talking to somebody in rural Manitoba. I mean, their voices in Parliament are just as important as somebody from Thornhill or Hampstead or Mount Royal. So those are important relationships to cultivate. And I think that one of the things that Canadians were looking for in Washington was to learn a little bit from the American experience, but to make it local, because obviously, if you are Canadian, you know that it's different. And Michael Levitt, who didn't speak on any of the panels, but gets credit for starting this pro-Israel coalition within Parliament, where you're having Tories and Liberals get together. They've tried hard to recruit folks from the Bloc and the Greens and the NDP, and they acknowledge that has not been so successful to date. But the fact that initiative is taking place encourages me. So I would tell you, if you are Canadian, the fact that AIPAC has a U.S. flag and an Israeli flag, it's pretty easy to add a maple leaf onto that, and they're actually pins. I think I've worn one in the past that have all three flags on them. And from a lobbying perspective, I think that the ability to engage members of Parliament, not just in your own riding, but across the country, is extremely important, because we are acting in a headwind. The tailwind is over. The demographics of both countries, the winds sweeping across college campuses are much more to our detriment than to our favor. And I think that's one of the key things that I took away from AIPAC, is that it invests an enormous amount to bring students to the policy conference. They don't pay, so they get a scholarship. The scholarship is obviously indexed to some extent to either current activity that they're engaging on in their respective campuses, with an incentive to continue that engagement as they go forward. And it's so gratifying. I mean, we're all going through life with our own biases. We'll talk about racism in a second. But if another Jew says something nice about us, we're kind of happy. If they're Christian, we're a little bit more surprised but happy still. And if they're Latino or black or Muslim, it's like, whoa, it's paroxysm. I mean, people are just, we don't expect it. So because we don't expect it, we're all the more grateful and happy when it happens. But it's still a very small, pardon the pun, a very small minority among the minorities on campus who have taken positions on Israel that we would consider to be favorable. And if you look at the number of Israelis who were at AIPAC this year, it was very small because they had an election. So that's something that the AIPAC conference organizers could not have anticipated, but for somebody who's been going to so many conferences for so many years, it was really, really noticeable. Israelis love to come to AIPAC. It's a party. If they work for the government, they're not paying for it. But captains of industry, if you work for any NGO, any non-government organization, any charity, any hospital, any school, you really want to be there because you're going to meet more pro-Israel Jewish activists, a higher concentration than anywhere else in the world at any given point in time. But this year, if you were there, it's like, why aren't you voting? What are you doing here? How are you going to get on a plane back to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem in time to cast the vote on Monday? So it turns out that United had now inaugurated a flight a few months ago from Dulles in DC over to Tel Aviv, but it only holds, 300, 400, 500 people. So not the 3, 4, 5,000 Israelis, maybe never 5, but you'd have 2,000, 3,000 Israelis at any previous AIPAC conference. So their absence was palpable. But the ones who did come, in many instances came with their booths, and you saw the Iron Dome battery, literally on the floor of the convention center. You had your Iron Dome battery. You had Sheba Hospital, which is a hospital, Tel Shomer, that has a field treatment center. And God forbid you never want to be treated in the field. You don't even want to be treated in a hospital. But if God forbid this happens to you, this is pretty advanced technology that they're able to deploy very quickly. And when you read about the crises in Haiti and Turkey and Armenia and other places where Israeli emergency rescue teams have been deployed, it's now a combination of the Army. It used to be the Army. Obviously, unfortunately, the Israeli Army has a lot of experience with battlefield medical care, but now the hospitals themselves have really developed these parallel facilities, and they're deploying them as needed. So from a public relations standpoint, also from a humanitarian standpoint, it's great that Israel's doing this. And every day you read a new article that the Israelis are about to come up with a vaccine for the coronavirus. They're not the only country trying, believe me. Everybody has an incentive to do it. And it's an opportunity to talk about what unifies us and what keeps us apart. So let's talk about the Israeli elections, what happened on Monday. And so while the Israelis who were not at AIPAC stayed home to vote, everybody was sort of speculating on Sunday, got some news on Monday, because they opened the polls at 3 o'clock. Sorry, they closed the polls and revealed the results at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in DC, which is 10 o'clock at night in Israel. So the polls close, Bibi wins. And nobody, and then David Horowitz, who always comes to AIPAC and addressed us the next morning, said in one of his articles, 59, 60, or 61, and what a difference that makes. I mean, if it's 61, clearly he's got a majority government and will move forward on what he wants to do. If it's 60, it's probably easy to recruit some defector. Everybody was talking about Orly Levy, Abakassis, David Levy's daughter, who formed her own party, Gesher, and then merged in with Labor Meretz, and she would be the healthcare minister on day one. I don't know who would want that job right now, but at 58, and at 59, it's really tough because you need 2 people. You cannot govern with 60. You need a majority to get stuff done. Bibi, by the way, had 60 votes without Lieberman in April of 2019. So the thought was they'd have a 65-member. So I don't want to get into all the numbers, but I'll just get into a few that I think matter. So in April of 2019, the first of the 3, it was pretty close. It was almost neck and neck, and it was pretty clear that because, Benny Gantz, being a relative novice politically, got up on stage and said we won. It looked like the exit polls had him 1 or 2 seats ahead, wound up being a tie, and then it became pretty clear that, someone should have told you that you need to build a coalition. You cannot run the Knesset with 35 seats. Bibi clearly is going to win because he has a natural constituency of 65, and he did with Lieberman. And then Lieberman stood fast on his rejection of the Orthodox parties, because he's not going to accept the fact that they're going to get a complete hall pass from conscription. And it was a game of chicken, and Bibi lost. So they had to have another election. So we went to a second election, and Bibi in the first election, Likud, it's gotten so personalized that I find myself talking about political parties in Israel based on their leaders. But Likud got 1.14 million votes in the first election. Kulanu, Moshe Kachlon's party that got into the Knesset with 4 seats, had about 250, maybe 300,000 votes. Call it 300,000 votes. It's about 70,000 votes per seat. So in the next election, Likud got fewer votes. And Kachlon, Kulanu merged into Likud. So Bibi collectively got about 350,000 votes less in September than he did in April. And everybody saw this as a huge victory, but they couldn't do anything. People didn't believe that the politicians were going to keep their word, and counterintuitively they did. Lieberman said, I'm not going to sit in a government that's not a coalition government between the two major parties. They couldn't get their act together. Gantz said he was not going to sit in a government led by a leader who's under indictment, and he didn't, and he had every incentive to do it. So we have to go to round 3. And what happens in round 3? Bibi got more votes, Likud got more votes in this election than any Israeli political party since the history of the country. 1.35 million votes. And he declared victory. And he still thinks he won. I mean, if you ask Bibi, his right-wing bloc has 55% of the vote. 55% voted, the voice of the people, 55% voted for his right-wing bloc, Likud. By the way, it's the first time in history that so few parties, only 8 parties, there have been a lot of mergers, but only 8 parties were, 8 slates were past the electoral threshold. You had Likud, Yamina, Shas, and UTJ, United Torah Judaism, on the right, and you had, Kachol Lavan, Labor Gesher Meretz, call it center-left. You had Lieberman, Yisrael Beitenu, which Bibi calls the left, and then you have the joint list, which we'll talk about in a second, with 15. So how does Bibi do the math? How does his right-wing bloc with those 4 parties result in 55% of the Knesset? He's only counting 105 seats. So without any shout-outs to Senator Sanders, whom I don't like, and we'll talk about his legislative record when we talk about the American election, but look, Avenue Q, very popular play, off-Broadway, on Broadway now, off-Broadway for a while. One of the funniest songs there is Everybody's a Little Bit Racist. You can look at that on YouTube as well. And if you can look at your own kishkas, we make judgments sometimes about a person's background, ethnicity, race, color. But here's Bibi, who has a track record of not being very kind to the Arab population in Israel, particularly as prime minister. In 2015, he scared the populace by saying the Arabs are voting in droves, Bahamonim, in magnitudes. Then he had, cameras set up in their population centers to intimidate them from coming to vote. This time, he took it way to another level. He said the only votes that count are Jewish votes, Jewish Zionist votes. And he actually has a chart. It was filmed. So that you've got the right Zionist parties, 58. You've got the left Zionist parties, where he puts Lieberman, 47. And then the 15 don't count. So if you don't count the 15, and only 105 seats in the Knesset matter, then he has 55%. And you have immediately disenfranchised 578,000 votes for the joint list. Not all the people who voted for the joint list are Arabs. Some Jews voted for the joint list, even Zionist Jews, who felt that the Israeli Arab population has been historically disenfranchised, and they have. 15 votes was a massive, massive success from their perspective. They never came close in the history of the country. They never came close to getting this many votes. They got 10 two elections in April of 2019. They didn't run as a joint list. There were two parties. The other two didn't make the electoral threshold. They learned their lesson. They combined once again to get to 13. And then here, because of the antipathy towards Bibi's, what they perceive to be racist perspective on them, because even before he decided to disqualify them from eligibility regarding anything that goes forward, they came out and, historically you'd have some that vote for Likud, but a lot would vote for Labor, Gesher, Meretz. You have some Jews voting for the joint list. But if you look at the Israeli Arab population as a percentage of the overall eligible voting population, they're just over 20% of the Israeli population. So if you do the math, that would entitle them to 24, 25 seats in the Knesset, right? It's exactly 20, it'd be 24, but they're a little bit higher, so they get 25%. Historically, they vote in very low numbers, 30%, 40%. They got up to close to 50% in voter participation. In this election, they were like 55%. But the overall voter participation in this election was over 70%, the highest since it's been since 1999, which I was surprised about. I thought that Israelis would have voter fatigue, and they did. Among Kachol Lavan, one of the reasons why Gantz did not do as well is because he was not nearly as aggressive. And neither was Lapid, and neither was Ashkenazi, and neither was Ya'alon. They were not nearly as aggressive as Likud was, because they had one objective in mind. And they tried it twice, and it failed. So I think people were very discouraged. Look, if you look ideologically, there's much more to bring together Kachol Lavan and Likud than what sets them apart. So if you look at it from the perspective, there are many different ways to look at the results of Monday, but one, if you look at it from Netanyahu's failure perspective, you're supposed to be this unifying leader. Most of the country agrees with you. Most of the country agrees with you on settlements. Most of the country agrees with you on nationalism. Most of the country, unfortunately, agrees with you regarding the Arab population. Most of the country agrees with you in terms of your leadership skills, your relationships with heads of state across the planet. I mean, you've pulled off so many diplomatic coups. Think about what he just did in 1 week. He flew to Washington, met with President Trump, got this dream, we talked about this in a previous class, this dream peace proposal, sitting in a room with the ambassadors of Bahrain, UAE, Egypt. Then you fly to meet Putin on your way back home and pick up a backpacker who was probably improperly arrested on trumped-up charges and deliver her back to her parents. I mean, who does that? And then the next week you turn around and you go fly to Uganda, where your brother was killed, 44 years ago, and 44 years ago. Sorry, your brother was killed 44 years ago, and you meet the president of Sudan, who flies down there to meet you, and yet you still lost. So obviously there's an issue here. I mean, you have all of these elements going on in your favor. You've got 3 tries at this. Wake up, pay attention, it's time for a post-Bibi future. Then there's the other interpretation. Here's a guy who's been indicted on 3 serious charges with 3 state witnesses and has gone through 3 elections where the only opposition is to get him out, where it's just anti-Bibi, no one's giving you any alternative policy proposals, nobody's seriously challenging your vision for what the future of the country and the future of the region ought to look like. And the indictment's already been served. You've got a trial date set in 2 weeks, and you still get not only more votes than any other party, you get more votes than any other party in the history of the country. So that should be a wake-up call to people who think that your time has come, that there are a lot of people out there who don't think so. There are a lot of people out there who think that from Bibi's perspective, I'm rightfully in this place, and there's a fair argument to be made. The judicial system should run its course. You should not be convicted in the press, and you should not be convicted at the polls. You should be convicted through a rule of law process, and Israel has, thank goodness, a very advanced legal system. Bibi's trying to play it both ways. For those of you who don't follow it as closely, you're obviously exposed more to Fox and CNN and what's going on in North America. this was the ugliest election in Israel's history. The ad hominem personal attacks that were hurled, particularly by Likud against Gantz, and calling him a philanderer and calling him corrupt and dishonest and demented, really medically demented, dementia, Alzheimer's, and making accusations about the Iranians having hacked his phone. They stopped at nothing to discredit him. But that's politics. Bibi is now trying to say that he should be able to present an immunity law that should give him immunity, but he's also trying to say that the Knesset is not eligible because of its caretaker status to pass a law that would require a prime minister, in other words, it would prohibit a prime minister under indictment from forming a government. Now, this idea first surfaced in 2008 when Bibi agitated for specifically this law against Ehud Olmert, who was under corruption. So it's so funny. If you read, you watch the videos, you don't have to read the papers. You watch videos of Bibi, head of the opposition, pounding the podium and says, there's no way in any country you could have a prime minister sitting in the Knesset one day and sitting in court defending himself the next day, which is exactly what he wants, unless he gets his immunity passed. So, welcome to the world. I mean, that's really what, and I really feel for Lieberman. The person I really feel for is Lieberman. I really do. Because, a lot of people are critical of him, but here's a guy who must be so conflicted, because who do you hate more, Netanyahu or the Arabs? And I don't think medical science has come up with a heart that's big enough to harbor as much hate if you throw in the Haredim as well. This guy hates so many people. I mean, what do you do? I think the future of the Israeli government coalition is going to rest on Lieberman's decision on who he despises more. Does he hate Netanyahu more than he hates the Arabs? And can he get over his hatred for the Haredim if he gets a senior enough ministry, or if they walk back some of their stuff? So I don't know how it's going to play out. I think that if I were advising General Gantz, I'd say be careful what you wish for. Because if let's say he's able to form, like Rabin did in 1992, one of these precarious, just to remind you, I mean, some of you may know this or not know this, Rabin ran against Yitzhak Shamir, the incoming prime minister in 1992. It was after Madrid, but before Oslo. And Rabin is another interesting story, right? He had been prime minister in 1977, but then he elegantly and nobly resigned once they discovered that his wife had foreign bank accounts, which was illegal at the time. You'd have to be cynical to think that I really wasn't. I mean, she fell on her sword in order to protect her husband and enable him to rehabilitate his political career, which he did. And then he took over the party from Shimon Peres in 1992, and he won a mandate of 56. But the two Arab parties that passed the electoral threshold at the time, Balad and Hadash, went with him to give him 61. But they weren't part of the formal coalition, but they bought him enough time to then seduce a new party, Shas, which had 6 votes, to come into his coalition. And the religious parties were not as nationalistic at the time, as far as, they wanted money for their yeshivot, money for their social programs. So Aryeh Deri, who then was running Shas and is again after he was indicted and spent several years in prison, is getting onto the Rabin team, and he gives them the 62 votes of legitimacy. They didn't need the Arabs anymore. This time it's different, because it's not 5 seats, it's 15. And that's a huge difference. And there isn't a Shas in the waiting. There isn't another group that can replicate that power in parliament that would enable Gantz to do in 2020 what Rabin was able to do in 92. So the theory is that he can form this minority government which really has a majority on certain things and keep his campaign promise on not relying on the joint list for ruling, but relying on the joint list for parliamentary votes. So they wouldn't be part of the government, they wouldn't have ministries. And maybe the Arabs can be bought off with some promises that there won't be any annexation, there'll be more money to their cities and to their schools and to their own sort of civic institutions. And if that happens, I mean, I'd feel pretty sorry for any prime minister trying to govern under those circumstances, compounded with the coronavirus. I mean, the national security threats to Israel always exist, but recently, Israel's enjoyed 10 years of economic freedom and prosperity. It's felt safer recently than ever before. People feel good about life in Israel till now. I speak to friends who are extremely frustrated that all these events are being canceled. They can't travel abroad. Their friends aren't coming to see them. This quarantine, I don't want to say it's exaggerated, but I gave you the numbers. New York, a city with twice as many people as Israel, has fewer than 3,000 people in quarantine, whereas Israel, with half the number of New York City, has close to 100,000 people in quarantine. It is bringing the Palestinians together because they had an outbreak in Bethlehem, and now so Bethlehem is under a self-imposed siege, and there's no travel between Bethlehem and any of the other major Palestinian communities. So that's going to be a huge crisis for anybody, any leader. So whether it's Netanyahu or Gantz who picks up the gauntlet, whether they may have a fourth election down the road, but that fourth election will be like those very special polling stations that they'll have for the people who came back, and the self-quarantine people just a few weeks ago were just a few thousand. The number increased tenfold in less than a week. That'll be the entire country at the rate that this is going. So let's think about that. So if Gantz is able to pull this off, he may wind up being a very, very short-lived prime minister. Bibi may or may not be able to get through his own legal issues. If he does get through his own legal issues, then he can come back and say, look, this was a disaster. This system didn't work. I've been cleared. Let's do this again. And you'll have a fourth election in about a year and a half. It's possible. The other things that are possible is, look, I still think Bibi may try to do a deal. I mentioned that a couple of classes ago. There's a lot of speculation about who might succeed him. I'll give you a couple of interesting anecdotes. Gideon Sa'ar was the person who actually wound up strengthening Bibi by saying, hey, I want to challenge him for the leadership, and wound up losing dispositively. I don't know that he's burnt himself within the party. I've learned that Israeli politicians are like zombies. They rise from the dead and come back and get reelected. I mean, it's a country that definitely recycles its politicians. So Gideon Sa'ar obviously has some future ahead of him. But the two or three people that folks talk about the most are Gilad Erdan, who has been around the block a little bit, but I don't know if any of you heard of him. If you haven't, it's because he doesn't get off the block very much. Yuli Edelstein, who I think is a compelling person. He wears a kippah. He's Russian. He's married to the daughter of an oligarch, and he's been the Speaker of the Knesset. He's very visible. He's fluently trilingual. He grew up in the former Soviet Union. His English and Hebrew are flawless. And he famously did not support either Sa'ar or Netanyahu in their primary. I think that would hurt him. The person who did support Netanyahu early and vociferously is his foreign minister, Yisrael Katz, who's the former transport minister, who was also investigated for corruption charges when he was the Minister of Agriculture. But he was born in 1955, right outside, in Ashkelon, right outside a little moshav called Kfar Achim, the village of brothers. And that village was started by the parents and their friends of a fellow who was born 4 years earlier, who also went into the Golani Brigades and served famously in the Israeli army, and that's Benny Gantz. So Benny Gantz and Yisrael Katz both grew up in a little small moshav outside of Ashkelon, went into the same military units. They're 4 years apart. I'm sure they knew each other growing up, and they've obviously intersected with each other over the years. So there is an ability for Israel to heal itself politically. So I think that if we get behind the noise, I'm optimistic that there can be some rational voices that come together and find a way to coexist, because that is the rational, natural alliance for Israel's political future. And if you don't believe me, ask the more than 2.5 million people who voted for both those parties, right? 2.5 million out of 6 million voters. So for just those two parties. And then, there's enough within some of the other, what I would call mainstream to the right, mainstream to the left parties, and you can include the Orthodox and give them a fraction of what they want, but maybe a fraction more than what they're entitled to based on their proportion in Israeli society. You can include the left if you want to have as large a tent as possible, but you don't need to include anybody. You don't have to. You've got 69 seats just among those two parties. Lieberman can make more noise or less noise. Bennett and Lieberman have both, when we talk about who is the natural heir for Bibi's scepter as the leader of the right, Lieberman and Bennett have both failed their constituencies, right? They haven't delivered anything, and I laughed a little bit about Lieberman's tightrope and how many chambers he has in his heart for hate for different people, but they've underperformed. So, and Bibi keeps doing this to Bennett, who's been, Bennett worked with Bibi. Lieberman was his chief of staff. So, along with some other people in the current Israeli ecosystem, these are folks who, for them, it's personal. But I think that the heir will pass to someone from within. Bibi now has control over how he wants to engineer a succession policy, but he first has to cross the Rubicon and decide that a succession policy is warranted. And so far, he's holding any of those cards extremely close to his chest. So let's come to the United States now. So the United States, while we were in Washington, I got there early, which is why we didn't have a class last week, had just a mess of a Democratic primary. We had Mike Bloomberg here a few weeks ago speaking at the synagogue, very popular amongst folks like us. You had Sanders, who I said earlier did an amazing job unifying all the participants at AIPAC by his unfortunate remarks. But just to give you a statistic that I was personally amazed by, a poll said that Sanders would beat Trump head-to-head 65 to 30%, more than 2 to 1 amongst American Jews.
Don't believe it.
I don't know whether I believe it or I don't believe it, but what surprises me is that we're living in an echo chamber, because that's certainly not among the Jewish people that I talk to and among the activists who go to Capitol Hill and participate in AIPAC. So there is a very large world out there, a very large constituency out there that we're not in touch with. But what I ask Democrats, and I've had the privilege of speaking with several, and whether it's Senator Schumer or Donna Shalala or Debbie Wasserman Schultz or Speaker Pelosi, they all come here. They all come to Florida. They fundraise here. Florida's an incredibly important state. I'm privileged to co-chair a pro-Israel PAC that does write checks to members of the House, members of the Senate, and candidates looking to run for office. We're actually going to be hosting an event for a woman who's running against AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. We'll get to her in a second. But the point is that the question has to be, what are you going to do? What are you going to do to restrain, reform those voices, those elements that are casting such a stain on a party that historically has been friendly to this issue? And they don't know. And there are examples. Mitch McConnell, love him or hate him, was very effective in tamping down the Tea Party, which in 2010, they should have taken the Senate. The Republicans could have easily taken the Senate the same way the Republicans took over the House, and they didn't, because you had a witch running in Delaware, you had a woman who talked about, you had a candidate talking about women volunteering for rape in Missouri, and you just had such crazy elements who won their primaries, the Roy Moores of the world, that enabled Doug Jones to win a Senate seat in Alabama as a Democrat. So can we learn any lessons from, the Mitch McConnells of the world? And they struggle with that answer. And I'm not a Democrat or Republican, but I was frustrated by how challenging it is for the Democratic leadership to get their fringe wing under control. So I was unbelievably impressed. This doesn't happen by accident. Unbelievably impressed by what happened within the Democratic Party from Saturday night to Thursday afternoon. Saturday, you had, whether you like Biden, hate Biden, or indifferent to Biden, he ran an unbelievably poor campaign. He underperformed at the debates. He underperformed in Iowa, worse in New Hampshire, wasn't even on the radar screen in Nevada. He counted on South Carolina to save him. He cultivated relationships in the black community. Jim Clyburn, who's the third-ranking Democrat and the highest-ranking black member of Congress, gave him a resounding endorsement, and he got 50% of the vote. He beat the next candidate by 30%. Tom Steyer, who spent $250 million of his own money and was the only candidate to talk about reparations for slavery and really thought that that would resonate within the African-American community, and it did, realize that if he can't win there, he can't win anywhere, sort of like Frank Sinatra played in reverse. And so he bowed out on Saturday. Pete Buttigieg, Sunday, quits. Super Tuesday, by the way, 14 states. People had spent tens of millions of dollars in those 14 states. They have campaign offices in those 14 states. The only person who didn't have campaign offices in California, or most of those 14 states, was Joe Biden. And Super Tuesday, so Buttigieg bows out on Sunday, doesn't announce an endorsement. Senator Klobuchar bows out on Monday, flies to Dallas to an event with Biden, endorses him, and then Buttigieg says, oops, okay, I'll endorse him too. Bloomberg wins American Samoa. Watch Jimmy Fallon or Stephen Colbert if you want jokes on that. But he does win, and he won it resoundingly. It wasn't even close. He got all the Samoans to vote for him, and you know, American Samoa is now like his Micronesia. You know, they love me here. They love me here. But didn't win any other state and performed very poorly. And he didn't spend tens of millions of dollars. He spent hundreds of millions of dollars. But before you cry for Mike Bloomberg, I mean, it's a transfer of very, very, very little wealth from a man who has so much to, if anybody of your friends work in media, whatever it was, he wasn't giving it to the Iranians. I mean, he was basically making airtime much more expensive for all of the other candidates in all of those states. And he performed poorly, and he was gracious enough to bow out. But he had a lot of pressure, and the person who probably had the most pressure was Warren, who bowed out on Thursday. So think about this. Except for Tuesday, where you actually had the Super Tuesday vote, every day a candidate bowed out. Steyer on Saturday, Buttigieg on Sunday, Klobuchar on Monday, we're voting Tuesday, Bloomberg on Wednesday, and Cia Warren on Thursday. But she did not terminate her Senate race, her presidential race. She suspended it. Why? And she didn't endorse anybody. All the other guys who bowed out endorsed Biden. Because she's young. She is 70 years old. Sanders is going to be 79 in September. Biden will be 78 in November. Biden had, you know, all sorts of medical issues in his life, and if you watch him, it's like, you know, I'm Joe Biden and I forgot this message. Sanders had a heart attack, and then came back after AOC endorsed him, came back to, you know, to rehabilitate his campaign. So Warren, I'm sure she wishes well on everybody, but I would not be surprised if we saw some crocodile tears coupled with a re-entry into the race. She's going to wait a while, I think, before we see an endorsement. I think that she feels, look, she's had issues with both Biden and Sanders, but we've seen before that you know, you can get over the personal stuff if it works in your own best interest. But I was curious and amused by the fact that she suspended her race. She didn't terminate the race. She's going to sit on the sidelines, and if she doesn't re-enter, and if these two gentlemen stay healthy, they're going to go forward to the convention this summer in Milwaukee. So what can we expect? I think we're going to expect a pretty divisive battle for the future of the Democratic Party. I think that Biden is clearly the consensus among the mainstream. I think, like I said earlier, I don't know if it was Clinton, Obama, Schumer, Pelosi, but some combination of them plus major donors in the Democratic Party definitely put the foot on the pedal, or the brake on all of the other campaigns, because it was critical for Joe Biden to have a better shot on Super Tuesday, and he crushed it. Look, that's kind of politics everywhere, but you've seen it here in the United States. There are these entitled legacy politicians who climb up through the ranks, and the disruptors are going to be either line cutters, you know, who could be mainstream Democrats. You know, Pete Buttigieg would be a good example of that. But it's not your turn. You're 37 now. I think you turned 38. Yay. So, but he's cutting the line. And then you have the gate crashers. People who are on the outside, never mainstream. Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has spent 30 years in Congress. Okay, let's just remind ourselves. 30 years in Congress, 16 in the House, 14 in the Senate. He hasn't accomplished anything legislatively. He's proposed 400 different bills and amendments. Some of his amendments got passed. An amendment is sort of like a little tweak that you put on to do stuff. But mainstream legislation that he has been the lead sponsor of in 30 years, 7. 2 of them have to do with renaming post offices in Vermont. I'm not kidding. You can look this up. This guy just shows up and he rants and he rails and he complains and he fetches and he yells. I mean, he does a great imitation of Larry David, but doesn't get anything done. You know, Joe Biden has history. I mean, he's also a career politician, never really did anything else. He was a very young senator. He ran for president in 1988 and was caught with plagiarism, so he stepped off. In 2008, he was an early candidate, called Obama relatively articulate for an African American, and Obama was so flattered and impressed that he picked him to be his vice president.
Very tender.
Which brings us to the next question. If Warren is not going to come back into the race, it's because these guys managed to stay healthy through the summer. In which case, one of them is going to get the nomination. In which case, the selection for vice president is going to be more relevant and more interesting than it has been in a very long time. So, you know, without speculating as to who's the specific candidates or nominees would be, I think I'm not going way out on a limb here by saying it's going to be an African American woman. And you've got choices. You've got Stacey Abrams, who ran more likely to be a Sanders running mate, but she could run with Biden as well. Kamala Harris, the senator from California, definitely a candidate. AOC is not a candidate because she's 30 years old, so she's not old enough to be a vice president. You got to be 35. She turns 35 in September of 2024. So don't think she's not, you know, watching the calendar on that one when she would be eligible to be a president, let alone a vice president. So, and there's some other people. There's a assemblywoman. I think she was a state senator in Ohio, Natalie Turner, and there are other people that maybe you don't have to be African American. I think you kind of would have to be a woman. I think Senator Klobuchar sees herself as a potential candidate, and you know, there are always surprises. If you don't believe me, ask, well, you can't ask John McCain anymore, but ask Sarah Palin. So there are some wild cards that could creep into the equation, but I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. And I'm gonna come full circle, because what's really going to test this between now and the conventions in Milwaukee, first the Democrats, and then the Democrats in July 16th, and then the Republicans in Charlotte, North Carolina, is what happens with this coronavirus. You know, markets fell a lot yesterday, they fell again today. You know, James Carville famously said, it's the economy, stupid, which is how, you know, one of the reasons why Clinton was successful, because people did not feel, you know, there was a mini recession going on there. We're in the face of a panic. Maybe that's, you know, why they call it a pandemic, but people are really panicking. As I mentioned earlier at the outset, from a epidemiology perspective, right? If you're an epidemiologist, you know, the infection rate is low, the mortality rate is low, but people are scared. You know, you coughed, everybody looked away. You know, look how much space you have around you. There's still 4 seats that one could put in. People are afraid. People are afraid. People are afraid to get on a plane. People are afraid to go to a bar mitzvah. People are afraid to go to, like I said, if AIPAC took place at the end of March, I don't know that you'd have 18,000 people. I don't know that it would still take place. It might have gotten canceled. So, and, you know, LA could go out of business for, you know, there are a lot of fixed costs in running an airline. It's not owned by the government anymore. So, the way this administration handles this crisis is going to be extraordinarily telling. You know, love him or hate him, Trump is a very expressive person,
And there's a lot of speculation about his vice, Paul Begala, who worked for Clinton and is now sort of a CNN pundit, pollster, is sure that on July 16th, when the Democrats are announcing who's going to be their presidential nominee in Milwaukee, he's going to replace Pence with Haley. And you want to know why? Because this is not something Begala said, but sure, if you want somebody to fail, give them the task to be the coronavirus czar. Nobody has any idea what's going on. Nobody knows how to contain this. The Iranians have 142 deaths reported. I'm sure you got to multiply that by a lot. They're now using force to prevent people from going, I guess now I learned the difference, China and Tehran, what's the difference between an authoritarian regime and a totalitarian regime. So that's probably worse. The Saudis canceled the Hajj. I mean, this is serious stuff. So it's not just the Jews anymore. So what we have is a huge crisis of confidence. And we talked about Gorbachev's analysis that Chernobyl had more to do with the disintegration of the Soviet Empire than any other single factor. We talked about Xi Jinping's command of communist China being under threat because of the way this is handled. He certainly threw people under a bus and replaced all the leadership of Hubei, the province in which Wuhan is located, in response to their perceived lack of response. But those were fall guys. So is the president throwing his VP under a bus by charging him with this role? I don't think so. But I do think that it's a curious choice. Vice President Pence doesn't have an enormous amount of experience with this portfolio. I mean, he was governor of Indiana, but governors too. Governor Rick Snyder, next door in Michigan, he lost because of the crisis with the water in Flint. So I think more than any other single factor, this election will be determined by lots of other things. People care about foreign policy, and people care about abortion rights, and people care about the Supreme Court. But it'll be about the healthcare implications and the economic implications associated with the American response to the coronavirus, and it's anyone's guess where this is going to go. So hopefully we'll still be congregating next year in this synagogue and other synagogues. So we'll see you on the next go around. Shabbat shalom.